In the heart of the dense Salem Hill forest, there was a secret known only to the shadows. The trees there were so ancient that even the wind, when it blew, seemed to tell forgotten stories, from times when creatures roamed free, before man believed he could dominate the supernatural. This is the story of a group of supernatural hunters who decided to challenge those shadows. They sought glory, they defied the unknown, and found much more than they could bear. I am Morticia, and on that night, I watched them. Prepare yourself, for where there is desire, there is despair, and where there is courage, there will always be fear. Jack, the team leader, was a tall American with a cold gaze and graying hair, a figure who radiated experience and a certain arrogance. He had spent his life hunting beings that most people didn't even believe existed: vengeful spirits, ancient beasts, and even demons. Jack bore a scar on his face, a reminder of an encounter with something he never told anyone about. For him, it wasn't just a job, it was a quest for the truth that escaped his nightmares. Beside him was Camille, a French woman with short hair and eyes sharp as blades. Camille was sensitive to the supernatural, a medium who carried the weight of the voices that followed her. She had undergone rituals and visions that left her emotionally worn, but for her, this was the only purpose she had left to keep living. Camille had always been solitary, and the darkness seemed to be her only true companion. They also had two other companions: Lucas, an impulsive Italian who preferred to fight before asking questions, and Sarah, an American with a disturbing past who wielded weapons as though they were extensions of her own body. Lucas was known for his intensity and mocking laugh, an attempt to cover the fear he would never admit. Sarah, on the other hand, was quiet and reserved, but carried a cold fury, a determination only those who had lost everything could understand. That night, the group received a mission in Salem Hill, where people had been disappearing. They said the forest swallowed them whole, but Jack and his companions knew there was more to it. They arrived at the place, a village of few houses, where the windows were boarded up and the eyes of the villagers carried the weight of terror. The elders murmured about the shadow, a presence that drew the curious in and never returned them. Jack laughed when he heard the account of one of the villagers, an old woman with a wrinkled face and sunken eyes, clutching a rosary with trembling fingers. "The shadow comes at night," she whispered. "It takes those with corrupt hearts." Lucas rolled his eyes. "Same old story. A spirit, a curse, a legend. Let's solve this before the sun rises." Camille, however, was uneasy. She felt something strange since they arrived in the village, a dense energy that seemed to penetrate her mind, as if the forest were calling to her. Jack noticed her discomfort and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It'll be fine. Just another night," he said, trying to hide the tension he also felt. But Camille knew this night would be different. She could feel the forest watching them. Just before midnight, the four entered the Salem Hill forest. The trees, tall and dark, seemed to form a cathedral of shadows where the moon barely managed to penetrate. Sarah led the way, holding a lantern that cast a flickering beam onto the ground covered in dead leaves. Camille walked alongside Jack, who held a weapon in hand and looked around attentively. Suddenly, a sound made them all stop. It was the sound of footsteps, light and rhythmic, echoing between the trees. Lucas quickly turned his head, trying to identify the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from all directions. "This isn't normal," murmured Sarah, tightening her grip on the lantern. "Relax, it's just the forest," Jack replied, trying to conceal his own unease. But he knew something was wrong. The air was heavier, and even the animals of the forest seemed to have vanished. It was then that Camille felt a presence approaching. Something touched her, not physically, but inside her mind, as if an invisible hand were trying to drag her soul to a place she didn't want to know. She closed her eyes, trying to protect herself, but the voice she heard in her head was clear and terrifying. "You are not welcome here." She fell to her knees, screaming, and the others rushed to help her. Lucas grabbed her shoulders, looking to Jack, who was visibly shaken. Camille began murmuring words in French, a prayer, or a plea for help. "It's the forest. It's alive," she said, her voice breaking and eyes wide with terror. "It knows we're here." Jack tried to keep them focused. "We have a job to do, remember? We're going to find the source of this and end it." But every step they took seemed to bring them closer to an invisible presence that watched them, cold and calculating. At one point, Sarah saw something between the trees. A tall, distorted figure covered in shadows, but with glowing eyes that seemed to burn with a spectral flame. "Jack, there's something there," she said, pointing, but when he looked, the figure was gone. They continued walking until they reached a clearing, where they saw strange marks on the ground. They were symbols carved into the earth, a language no one recognized. Lucas stepped forward to get a closer look, but as he touched the soil, he felt a shock that made him scream and stumble back. "What is this?" he exclaimed, terrified. Camille knelt beside him, trying to read the symbols. "This is not human. It's an ancient language, something from a time when the world was ruled by forces we've forgotten." Jack looked around, and for the first time in years, he felt something he never allowed himself to feel: fear. He knew they weren't dealing with a simple entity. This was something much bigger, something that fed on the very essence of those who dared challenge it. Suddenly, the lantern lights began to flicker, and an intense cold swept over the area. Camille started to tremble, clutching her arms, and that's when something appeared in the clearing. A tall, dense shadow, with an almost tangible presence, and where its eyes should have been, two black orbs that absorbed any trace of light around them. The creature advanced quickly, and Lucas, impulsively, tried to attack it with a knife. But as soon as his blade touched the shadow, he was thrown back with brutal force, crashing against a tree with a sharp thud. He screamed, but no one could help him. Jack yelled to the others, "Run! Now!" They ran, but the forest seemed to fold around them, turning into a maze with no way out. Camille tried to scream, but her voice was muffled, and amidst the panic, she saw Lucas being dragged along the ground, as if invisible hands were pulling him into the darkness. He fought, but his screams were quickly silenced, until only silence remained. "We can't leave him," Sarah shouted, trying to turn back, but Jack grabbed her. "He's gone," he said, his voice cold, as if coming from someone who had already accepted their fate. "We need to survive." But it was too late for survival. The forest wanted them, and it would have them. Sarah was next, her feet sinking into the ground as if the earth itself were swallowing her. She screamed, and Jack tried to hold on to her, but the soil consumed her until nothing was left. Camille, now alone with Jack, trembled uncontrollably, and she knew there was no escape. Jack looked at her, his eyes empty of hope. "Do you still believe we can escape?" she asked, her eyes filled with tears. Jack didn't answer. He knew everything was lost. And then, in the last instant, the shadow enveloped them. I saw their souls fade, fear turning into resignation, and all that remained was silence. The forest returned to its dark state, and the people of Salem Hill would never hear of those hunters again.